The development industry is often seen as an innate good, yet it is hierarchical, plagued by racial, misogynistic, heteronormative, and class-based structures. I talk about the development industry as an umbrella term that includes non-governmental organisations, otherwise known as NGOs, aid workers, government departments, and intergovernmental organisations. As awareness of development expands and discussions around more difficult topics are happening, we are also seeing more conversations around development dynamics. For instance, discussions about the race of aid workers and complex topics such as the white saviour complex. But we aren't going far enough. We need to question all normalised practices within development. Whilst development has been happening since the colonial period, the movements towards a formal development industry happened in the post-war period when the UN, World Bank, and similar institutions were created, and in 1949 when Harry Truman brought development to the main stage, using it in his inaugural speech. If we don't question the accepted norms created by these events, then we aren't effectively using development in the modern world. If we accept that development is based on the normalisation of certain ways of life and has certain normative assumptions, it may not come as a surprise that being LGBTQ+ in development is being constrained to a mould that doesn't fit. Not fitting industry stereotypes means development isn't as effective for you and often having your needs neglected. And I think it's time this was talked about. And not just in academic journals that are only read by researchers, but in an accessible way. So, welcome to my mini podcast series. I am an LGBTQ+ global development student, and I want us to have a conversation. If you do too, have a listen, research what interests you, and start your own discussion. Across these 4 episodes, I discuss the role of NGOs, sexualisation of LGBTQ+ people in development, the westernisation and neocolonialism in the development industry, and finally LGBTQ+ economics and healthcare. This episode is all about NGOs and global governance. Are they inclusive of LGBTQ+ people? Is their work effective? And what is their relevance? Development agencies and NGOs are dependent on governments and international organisations, not only as donors, but also as the group who sets the standards. So what are the laws and regulations? The Brazil resolution was proposed at the UN in 2003 and called for the protection and promotion of human rights for sexual orientation. The resolution was postponed as it was felt it wouldn't pass. However, it was the starting step for other legislation. In 2006, the Yogyakarta Principles on the Application of International Human Rights Law played a large role in outlining expectations around gender identity and sexual orientation. Principles include the right to protection from poverty, the right to practice, protect, preserve, and revive cultural diversity, and the right to freedom from criminalisation, all in relation to sexual and gender identity. But has this really done anything for those involved in development? NGOs still face a limit on what they can say and do. Each country has their own laws and standards that can massively impact the reality of these regulations being put in place. For example, the Ugandan government's 2014 Anti-Homosexuality Act saw pushbacks against the spread of LGBTQ+ organisations and institutionalisation of LGBTQ+ rights. Or we see the 95% rejection rate of Black lesbian asylum seekers in Germany. And it is the job of NGOs to help fight against or pick up the slack where states or citizens are lacking. Institutions have a role in addressing stigma and preconceptions. This is a clip from Victor Madrigal Borloz, a UN independent expert discussing this concept at a panel discussion, the link for which can be found in the transcript for the video provided in the podcast description.
I think the winning formula is that actually has inclusion as the very core. I always say to my interlocutors that whenever I organize a meeting or a consultation, I always ask myself, who am I leaving out? And because of that approach, when I work in a particular setting, I am, of course, taking the state institutions as point of entry, the judiciary, the executive, and the parliamentary. But I know that it's impossible to have a full, objective, and comprehensive picture if I am not acknowledging the input of civil society and also of people with lived experiences and other forces of society, including business and media and even religious organizations. All of these institutions, in fact, have a role to play in addressing and deconstructing stigma and preconception. Let me give you an example. I was just in a country visit to Tunisia, a country, the context of which has enormous promise for addressing discrimination, and that has gone a very, very interesting process since the revolution some 10 years ago. In that equation, understanding how civil society is positioning itself, but also how religious discourse interacts with violence and discrimination, how LGBT people are portrayed in the media, what type of portrayals are those, whether they're positive or negative, and even how is business embracing models of diversity, is the only way to really create a comprehensive overview of the way violence and discrimination occurs in a context.
A quote that neatly addresses LGBTQ+ people in development is, "Marginalised people act politically whenever they create spaces in which to express themselves, feel free, and define their own communities." Now, this is important because from early on, NGOs have defined themselves as people who interact with and influence the state. NGOs' work predominantly revolves around everyday citizens. This means that they are the group in society who join both sides together. The people, other than governments, with the ability to influence and change the important global issues we see. NGOs are meant to address poverty, security, and human rights. NGOs should work to improve and address the problems faced by people who are struggling. And this definitely includes minority groups. I would argue that working for under-addressed problems and neglected peoples should be the focus of NGOs. Yet historically, and to a certain extent to this day, most mainstream NGOs have not had an LGBTQ+ mission or vision statement. This small action can really impact their ability to fully step into the role of being an NGO. In not including a significant population in development, the relevance they have in effective development is limited. Scholars even in the 90s have questioned the impact of NGOs and development work. This is a conversation that has been ongoing, but has seen relatively small shifts since the start. LGBTQ+ NGO workers face many difficulties. This is particularly true for those who work within the Global South. They constantly risk being outed and their safety being compromised. However, it can be difficult no matter what role the worker plays. NGOs often don't have specific policies for same-sex couples, instead using general policies of non-discrimination and trying to adapt based on the situation. This can lead to challenges where the partner of the aid worker is not given the same benefits seen by straight couples. Workers are the backbone of NGOs, and by risking their mental health, well-being, and safety through limited protection and policies, NGOs are quite literally putting lives on the line. The struggles faced by staff can be, in part, due to wider LGBTQ+ issues in development. Development agencies constantly have to assess whether tackling LGBTQ+ issues is important enough. This is particularly true for smaller agencies working within more hostile countries. Incorrectly assessing the situation can result in operation licenses being taken away, the safety of staff members being put in jeopardy, as well as outing LGBTQ plus people in the local area. 90% of LGBTQ plus programs were launched after the 90s. Wendy Wong and David Lake argue that networks are important in forming international norms. The relative newness of LGBTQ plus development networks brings with it both positives and negatives. It can be argued to be naive, have lots of room for mistakes, be underfunded, but it also means it should, at least in theory, be less dependent on historical norms in development. However, currently we see conformity by LGBTQ plus NGOs to the standards set by the wider development industry. Why are NGOs hiding from confrontations? Well, in general, NGOs can fall into an elitist and exclusionary pattern, and a growing number of studies are arguing that NGOs are just as likely to maintain the status quo as they are to make changes. The development industry has gatekeepers that keep NGOs in check, creating the boundaries allowed for each area. This means that no matter how revolutionary a worker or an organisation is, being pushed into certain stereotypes and structures by others in the development field is common. Funding also has a major impact on how an NGO functions. It is important to note here that there are general NGOs that can have LGBTQ plus projects, and there are specialised LGBTQ plus NGOs. Even though LGBTQ plus organisations have grown, it is still a small field, with most organisations having an annual budget of under $1 million. In 2007, the total funding for LGBTQ plus rights across the South and East was only $10 million, with the largest amounts going to international organisations based in the North. In 2010, the budget did reach $35 million. However, considering that in 2020, Britain alone spent £14.5 billion on aid, it's relatively small change. Resources are also unevenly spread within the LGBTQ plus community, with more funding going to organisations led by gay men compared to lesbians, trans, or bisexual people. This leads to less productive work even within the community and creates yet further hierarchies. Whether or not individuals want to change things, the system is against them. The funding simply isn't there. This doesn't mean it's impossible. It means that larger organisations with the funding need to step up to make a difference. We need to see a shift in policies across the industry, not just in a few organisations. The nature of NGOs can make it difficult for them to connect with the population they are trying to work with. In order to effectively work within the community, there needs to be a strengthening of grassroots projects. They need to see increased funding and safety improvements. It is difficult for smaller NGOs and local movements to question the norm without larger international NGOs taking on some of the fallout. For example, in Lagos, a mainstream public health organisation was given an eviction notice because they worked with men who have sex with men. Larger organisations need to start leading from the front and working with a diverse range of people, including LGBTQ plus people, in order to allow NGO work to thrive. NGOs do have the opportunity to fix things, but by subscribing to international norms within the industry, they aren't going to bring about the necessary changes. It is so important that the development industry is inclusive and diverse in its work. Only by making sure that everyone's voices are heard is the industry going to get anywhere. Laws, protections and ideas can be put in place, but they will only work when we truly understand the needs of gender and sexual minorities in the Global South and beyond. In the next episodes, I discuss some of these key aspects to being a gender and sexual minority in the Global South. This includes the sexualisation of LGBTQ plus people in development in episode 2, colonialism and westernisation of gender and sexual identities in episode 3, and finally healthcare and the economics to being LGBTQ+ in episode 4. It is by no means an exhaustive list or explanation, but it's a good place to start, so why not give them a listen?